Well, hello everyone. I am so excited. Gary Wayne is with us today. Gary Wayne is an incredible author. If you have not read his books, I really urge you to read his books if you want some incredible information about the real accounts of our ancient past, where we're at today. It includes a lot of things. Gary Wayne has written The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, Book 1, and The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, Part 2. The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, How Secret Societies and the Descendants of Giants Plan to Enslave Humankind, Book 1. And then the Book 2, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, Part 2, How Understanding Prehistory and Giants Helps Define End Time Prophecy. Gary, I am so excited to have you here with us today, and I know everybody else is as well, so I can't wait to get into this. I will include visuals of your book at the very end of the video for everyone, and you can find them in several places. I found your books in Amazon. You might want to let everybody know the other areas that they can find them.
Yeah, and thank you for inviting me to your show. And so happy to be here and to, hopefully talk about a few things that help connect a few dots for your audience and maybe some information that they haven't come across before. So, yeah, my books are available through my website at the genesis6conspiracy.com if you want to get a signed copy. And there's 3 by pages there, so be careful of that. By page one is book one, by page two is book two. If you want a bundle, it's page three. To get the discounts, there's discounts on each page, but to mix and match the books or get one of each, you go to page three. If you live in the US, there's a US page. If you live in Canada, there's a Canadian page. If you live anywhere else in the world, there's an international page. And you can link over to Amazon.com directly from the website, BarnesandNoble.com, Amazon.ca, and you can also link over to Amazon for the Kindle version of each. So if you want the digital, those are available, and also to Amazon Audible for the Audible of each. So it's available in, the most common sort of formats. And so that's the easiest way to get a hold of my book or contact me is through their website because you can, as I say, you can link directly over to those other sources. And on the website, there's a generous excerpt of all 98 chapters of book one, all 84 chapters of book two. And if you think there's a lot of information there, you haven't read anything I've done because the books are just loaded with information and it's just a small drop in the ocean of the information that's in those books.
Your books are incredible and mind-blowing, mind-blowing. So I'm so looking forward to getting into how we got here in the ancient
Yeah,
story.
it's isn't that the big question, right? That
Hmm.
isn't answered in most churches or in universities or anywhere else. They only give you more questions than answers, and all of them tend to say if you ask the wrong questions, that maybe you should leave. So it's hard
Oh,
to it's hard to get the good information. So so that's what I try and do is cover off some of the information that isn't generally sort of talked about, but do it in a research sort of manner and show the sources so people can check out the veracity of what I'm talking about and judge for themselves. And so when we look at the beginning, and a lot of people look at the antediluvian or before the flood, particularly from a standard dogma of Christian uh, doctrine, is that that's it. There's only 6,000 years between where we are today and the birth of Adam, and in there was a flood. So that's it. Well, what I would suggest to people is we may want to have a closer look at that, and that we have a genealogy that goes back to Adam, but the account in Genesis 2 is completely at odds with the account in Genesis 1. And I won't go through all of those discrepancies, but there are things that just they're in conflict. So either the Bible is in conflict or there's another creation that's going on. And so if that's the case, then we don't know how old the world is, even on that limited basis between Adam and the people of day six. So one of the examples of things that are different, and I know the Bible and I use this a lot, but you have to be careful and you have to be consistent with it, is that the Bible has an MO of adding additional information to information already provided. And so a lot of people will say, well, that's what Genesis 2 is for Genesis 1. The thing the Bible doesn't do is add information that's in conflict to what
Mhm.
it's already said. So that's where you should dig a little bit deeper. So if we sort of overlay in 2 Peter 3 onto this, where it says 1,000 years for us is like a day for God. Well, all of a sudden we may have an extended period of time. And if there's two different creations, it doesn't say a day eight. So we have no idea how long after day seven Adam might be created. And people might say, well, but in creation of days 1 through 6, you have, in about day four, you have 24 hours that are described as the sun and the moon sort of come in, but the light actually comes in, which is Jesus, as he talks about himself in John 1 and 8, as being the light in the darkness didn't recognize, starts then. So, what is the day, length of day? Because in the first 3 days, you don't have the sun and the moon in the firmament. So is it 24 hours after that, or is it all consistent?
Mhm.
One day for God is like 1,000 years for men, and I would probably lean towards the latter, but I'm open to both. But no matter what, we have this gap in time. And then the other issue is that, like Adam is created in singular, and sometime later Eve is created, and because no suitable partner could be found, which is kind of an odd statement. And so there would be no suitable partner, right? Unless there was other people.
Exactly.
And that again, and there's so many things like that. And so in day six, people are created in multiple and told to multiply and spread out around the earth. Well, that doesn't happen with Adam and Eve. He goes into the garden and he becomes an agrarian rather as nomads, right? So you have this, and the details just get farther and farther apart. So with this, that is a premises that we don't know how old the earth is based on Genesis 1, 2 forward, then let's look at, do we really know how old it was based on Genesis 1, 1 to 2? And maybe we do not. And again, the standard dogma, as with Exodus 20:11, is that the heaven and earth was created in 6 days, and then God rested on the seventh day. So people say, well, that's the end of the story, except that heaven, Hebrew word Shemaim, is understood as three different meanings. It can mean the firmament that's created in the renewal of the earth, which Exodus 20:11 would be referring to. It can also mean what's outside the firmament, and it can also mean the dimension where God and the angels dwell. So you have to be careful which heaven is
Mhm.
Exodus 20:11 talking about. And heaven is actually called the firmament in Genesis 1. So I would look at that as a renewal of the earth, and I'll get into the basis for that. And where I get that term renewal of the earth is from Psalms 104, where it says, and this is also including other creation aspects in Psalms 104. They have the creation of the angels, for example. So this is talking about a period that's quite old. And when God sends the Spirit, the earth is renewed. Well, who's hovering over the darkness and the chaos in Genesis 1, 2? The Ruach of the Elohim, the Holy Spirit. And the light enters in Jesus in Genesis 1, 3. So now all of a sudden we've got, well, that's an interesting passage. You can't really do much with it unless you have more of a basis for it. But when you get into the word was, as in the earth was, or the earth was void and without form, or formless and void, those are the Hebrew words tuhu and bohu. And tuhu and bohu both mean to become a ruin, to be destroyed. Something has happened. And so those words aren't chosen without perfection if you believe in the word of God. It has to be related to something. And so that word was could be translated as became. It's the Hebrew word haya. And so the standard doctrine is the earth was. But the two words, tuhu and bohu, following that don't exactly fit was, but fit became a ruin, became void. That's why you have this chaos. And that's the same description that's talked about in all of the polytheist accounts around the world. And so if the world had become destroyed, then you would renew the earth in the 6 days. And now passages start to make some sense. So if we go to Isaiah 45 for the um, premise is that it says God doesn't create anything not to be uh, lived in. And that's really interesting because when you get into that passage, um, and he doesn't create anything in vain. He creates things to be lived in. That word vain is tuhu. Doesn't create anything as a ruin. So in Genesis 1:1, it says he created the heavens and the earth. And in Isaiah 45, he says he does it all at once. He doesn't create it unfinished unless something happened to it. So back to 2 Peter 3, which is really a terrific template for prehistory. It said, in the beginning, there was this destruction by fire where the earth perished. Well, most people say because it's talking about the earth that was in the water and out of the water, that would be the flood story. Well, except that everything on the earth perished, but not in the water. So the whole planet didn't die. But it did in the beginning, as it's talking about in the exact same language, only using Greek instead of Hebrew. In the beginning, this destruction by fire that's also reserved for the end time, which explains why the flood comes and the technology level that we're just catching up to just before the flood is there's an intercession there by God on humankind's behalf to prevent the world being destroyed by fire because that's reserved for the end time like it was in the beginning because nothing is new under the sun. What was will be again. And the understanding of this is only going to bring grief and sorrow. So there's a set time period, not just 6,000 years, but now we're talking about a longer frame and that this destruction that is done in the beginning would have collapsed the firmament and destroyed it down to the foundations, as what is talked about in other passages in the Bible in describing this destruction. And again, the foundations are mentioned in 104, just as they are in the book of Job and a few other passages. You could do 3 hours on just going through this one topic. So I'm moving fairly quickly just to get to where we're going on it. And so this is a destruction that would have had the waters above collapse onto the water below. That's why you would have the earth that was in the water, that was out of the water, that's being talked about in this destruction by fire. So when God goes to renew the earth, he separates the waters below to the waters above and creates the firmament to start the process of renewing the earth. So all of a sudden everything starts to fit into place. So what would cause this kind of destruction? And why is it reserved for the end time? What's the relationship? Well, the relationship is in the creation at the beginning of angels who are there at the beginning of creation. And they're celebrating in Job 38, 4 through 7. The morning stars and the sons of God are celebrating creation and the foundations that were laid for creation. So again, everything starts to fit in the typology and how the Bible works if you let it, and that angels rebelled. And angels have this angelic technology that I was just referring to that was passed on to the antediluvians and including the giants that brought it to the capability of destroying the world by fire, that God prevented that likely with the flood to let everybody whose name's in the book of life have that opportunity to leave their names in that book or have it blotted out from a monotheist perspective. And so when we look at that, that's a better location for the destruction of the earth with an angelic rebellion, and that planet destroying capability that they would have had. So when we see destruction of planet capability weapons, we see that sort of show up in the Vedas.
Mhm.
Most people say, well, that's just going to be before the flood. But I'm thinking that might be an older recollection, just as the recollection of the Vedas is said to be much older than the standard secular dating for it, like thousands and thousands of years older. So seems to be a bit of a better fit there for the angelic rebellion, and that this relationship begins with humankind with the creation of day six. They probably lead them astray as well, because you have the creation of Adam, who's now created for a special sort of commission. And in all cultures around the world, you have the gods who provided both before and after the flood. The fallen angels is in the book of Enoch from a monotheist perspective. The angelic knowledge to develop civilizations and the seven sacred sciences that we understand today, and how that merged with the angelic technology. So this is a relationship that begins with Adam in terms of what we're concerned about, because likely they were worshiping all of the pantheon. And just as what had happened before, and there was probably people before, we just, have to look at some of the scientific records of some of this ancient dating to get a little bit of some data points to suggest that they're doing the same thing, because nothing is under the sun, they as being the fallen angels. And so we have this Nahash being, this serpent being, that's going to deceive Eve, and it's a beast of the field, and that would be created on day six as well. But if it's 1,000 years, then a hash could have been created 1,000 years before male and female were created. And if that's the case, they may have had a very high level, and this is a walking, talking, intelligent being. And as you take that Nahash back to Hebrew, it means sorcerer, it means necromancy, it means all of the things of polytheist priest would be labeled as from a monotheist perspective. Obviously, the polytheist would look at that as well, that's just enlightenment and knowledge, and it's the application of the knowledge that you need to determine whether it's good or evil. So, and this is the being that would have been maybe in a superior position because it was larger than a human, according to the Gnostics. It was as big as a camel. And this is the being that Satan, I think, is going to be using to deceive Eve, and it's not Satan directly, but either using the Nahash as his avatar and with him as the avatar, or coaching the Nahash on their behalf, because Satan is not a serpent in Eden. He's a cherubim, as Ezekiel 28 talks about.
What's a
And
trubim?
so in the book, it is another watcher angel.
Mhm,
A seraphim would be the serpent one.
mhm.
A cherubim has four faces. Has a face of a lion. It has a face of an eagle. It has the face of a bull and the face of a human. And there's two other groups. There's the Ophanim, which has a similar understanding to a cherubim with four faces, except one of them is the face of a cherubim. We're not told which or all four, but the other
Um,
faces are the same. And we have the archangels. So those are the four watchers. And Ophanim is that group that is named in the book of Enoch. We get that biblically in the Ezekiel vision of Isaiah, not Isaiah, Ezekiel 1, 3, and 10, where you have the cherubim that are described, and we get the description of those faces, but then we get these concentric wheels, wheels within wheels. So when it's talking about the wheel part, that's the Hebrew word gagal for wheel, as in gagal Raphaim, or the wheel of the giants, right? But when it's talking about these wheel angels, the word switches to Ophan,
mhm.
which is Ophanim in the plural. So that's the other sort of group of angels. So Satan has aspects of many orders, just as in Isaiah 14, it's where it says Lucifer, son of the morning in the KJV. Technically, it's Hail El Ben Shakar, Hail El, son of the morning, and that's one of the names of Satan. And so he's got a part of of a morning star order. And there's also a connection in there to jackal as you split that word into its source words as a howling, which has a connection to like gods like an Anubis order. We don't get an Anubis order described with these jackal gods, but we get the howling gods in the Bible, which would be probably what that's talking about. Satan is also known as a serpent and a dragon, which would make him in part high priest and seraphim angel. And in Ezekiel 28, he's this anointed cherubim that walks amongst the fiery stones, except that cherubim don't do that. Only the seraphim do, as Isaiah 6 talks about. And so he's got the high priest title that he likely lost in his fall, which is going to be replaced with the Melchizedek order in the future time with Jesus. And he has 9 jewels, just like you have 12 jewels with the Levite order representing it's progressing to another level and eventually going to be taken over by Jesus. So when we look at the book of Enoch now, the name of Satan isn't Lucifer in Eden. The name isn't Halel. The name isn't Samael as the mystical Judeans or mystical people of the Jewish community would name Satan in his seraphic form. It names it as Gadrael. So
Mm,
we don't get Satan's name biblically in his cherubic form,
mm,
but Gadrael means, even because you can take that back to Hebrew if you do a little bit of work, which I did, I tend to do that. It means the wall of God or God's wall. So those are two Hebrew words that we know is likely one of the names describing one of the different aspects of Satan. So you have the where I sort of got off on this off ramp, and I'll now come back is that you have in the first revenge of the fallen angels against the Adamites a use of a group of people that were serpentine looking, like the Seraphim Watchers, who created most of the giants, not all, because cherubim would have created uh, Nephilim warriors like lion men of Moab, lion-like men of Gad biblically, or Arioch, one of the giant kings out of Mesopotamia in the Genesis 14 war. That means um, lion-like. These were like the antediluvian Irmahalu, which were recorded on reliefs in Sumeria, and probably offspring of a godlike Gal, which would have been a war god, just as cherubim are warriors, just as you have the cherubim guarding the gates with these swords of flame after Adam and Eve are ostracized out of the Garden of Eden for the fall. And so you might want to look at lion Nephilim that are described all throughout the Middle East and around the world and shown on reliefs. I have some great pictures of that on the Lion Men document that I put up on the Facebook, and it's just absolutely astounding, some of those looks. So you also have, uh, um, the cherubim has black hair and black curly beard um, in the human face that it has. So if it took a human form versus a lion form
mhm,
to produce giants, it would look like that. So now we have dark-haired giants like Gilgamesh that have that exact sort of same description. And then what's also really sort of interesting out of the Sumerian tradition is we have Anunnaki, which
mhm,
are watchers. These are the Gigi. Gigi goes back to the Sumerian word Igi for eye, as in to watch, just as watcher is Ayer in Hebrew, going back to watch. It's amazing the connections between these ancient languages and the same types of beings, but we see these dark-haired, black-bearded, black-haired angels with wings around doing some sort of ritual around this sort of tree of life, right?
mhm,
And that are on reliefs. But we also see the same depiction now with the same type looking type of angels, except for the head, and the head is of a bird or an eagle.
mhm,
Another depiction of a cherubim just taking an eagle form. So what's interesting about that is that in Southeast Asia, they have watchers, and in China, they, they have watchers who created offspring called the Tengu, which have a bird face, and there were Nephilim, there were warriors and priests for the most part. But again, the same sort of analogy that you have with the sons of God who procreated with humans to create giants. And in most of the cases, it was seraphim, which is why most of the gods and most of the kings, because the seraphim ones, which were blonde haired, red haired, blue eyes, and green or hazel eyes, um, also looked like serpents originally. And they're described as serpents before the flood. And even with Akhenaten, even let's say over 1,000 years after the flood, if you look at that imagery, you've got a pharaoh who is losing some of those serpentine characteristics, but they're still there. He's got this long protruding chin, very high cheekbones,
Hmm.
these large wraparound eyes because the giants were shining ones and their eyes would light up a room and their voice would just be like, amplified as Atlas bellowing out of the earth in the Greek descriptions. And he has this elongated skull, and you look at him, and there's a giant skull, and they have to create these great big hats to cover them because they're a different being. They're hybrid humans and gods or angels, and so he turned look at that Akhenaten face. That's a serpentine looking face with the thin lips, and I encourage people to look at that. But it's stunning. But over time, they lost those kind of features, right? By intermarrying with humans after the flood because of fertility issue and the inability to produce enough females, which continues to this day down to the Royales. So again, we don't know how old and how many creatures and how many chimeras and other things with that technology was created before Genesis 1 to 2,
Hmm.
and then before the flood, and then again shortly after the flood with the offspring gods like Baal. And if I people haven't heard the difference between a parent god and offspring god, parent gods ruled before the flood, offspring gods rule after the flood. So Greek mythology, you're going to look at Kronos as being the chief male patriarchal god, rule, and Gaia as the matriarchal um, goddess. And after the flood, it's going to be Zeus that's going to be the chief god, off and son of Kronos. Um,
So where did
in
the parents
Sumeria, you're
go?
looking at, yeah, they go to the pit prison.
Uh, and in
In
Samaria?
mythology and in Sumeria, they go to the pit prison too.
Hmm.
Sumeria and in all the polytheist accounts are the same. They use an allegory there, I think, because they disappear. But you can't kill an immortal,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? But
Oh.
they're no longer having access, and it's the parent and it's the offspring gods that move up to replace them, who didn't go to the pit prison, but go to the pit prison after the flood because they do the same crimes, right? And
Hmm.
that's why Baal is said to be killed. So Baal is the offspring of El in the Canaanite pantheon, right?
Hmm.
And you can look at in the Sumerian pantheon as Anu as the parent god, right? And it includes Tiamat, which is an interesting one, but not as the consort of Anu. But that's a different sort of rabbit hole. Um, and after the flood, you would look at either Enlil or Enki as being the two chief gods after the flood, because they're offspring of Anu.
Hmm.
And the original Anunnaki giants before the flood are produced by Anu, right? So the name comes from that. Anu is uh, uh, is basically the chief god, and it also means An as heaven. So these are the heavenly ones, right?
Hmm. Do you have any
So
idea the
you get the
origin of these beings?
well, yeah. So they have different accounts in polytheism, just as you have a different account in monotheism. So the easiest way to understand it is through the Gnostic religion that New Age and Theosophy are extensions out of. And they look at the creation of 12 archons that they would include God and Satan on. And that Sophia is the goddess, the mother goddess, who is going to somehow produce these 12 archons archons through this nebulous life force that's male to create these 12 archons. So they come from the two original parent gods, however you want to set them, whether or not they're part of the 12 that's below or not. Um, I think people have a lot of different sort of opinions on that, but there is this distinction between the two in the beginning of polytheism. Biblically, it's Jesus who, before he becomes flesh, he's known as the Word of God or Jehovah of the Elohim. Just as you have the Ruach of the Elohim as the Holy Spirit,
Right.
you have Jehovah of the Elohim, who's introduced in 2:4, even though he's in Genesis 1:3 as the light, as Jesus defines himself. And when God Elohim speaks, that's the Word. And so Jesus is described as the Word of God who created all things at God's command. So we get that in John 1 and Colossians 1. So
Mm,
it is the word, or Jehovah of the Elohim from the Hebrew wording. We would know that as the same source for the word of God, which is the logos of the Theos. So Jehovah of the Elohim. It's just you have to understand that we get the New Testament from Greek, so we don't get the same words, which would be
mhm,
easier, but we get them used in a similar sort of way if they're translated correctly.
mhm.
And so Jesus creates all of the angels. And
Oh,
so there's a source in every account. One is more polytheistic in how they're created. And typically the mother goddess like Sophia would be like a Holy Spirit equivalent. Just as the Holy Spirit provides wisdoms, Sophia means wisdom. That's the Greek word for wisdom. And when you get philosophy, that's the wisdom of Sophia
mhm, mhm.
or the theology of Sophia of Sophia. Yeah, I'm tripping over my tongue. So it's amazing how both polytheism and monotheism
Mhm,
have accountings of the same understanding, just seen through either a monotheist lens or polytheist lens.
mhm.
But they're talking about the same things.
And now, are there lineages connected to these beings that are still here today that haven't been wiped out?
So you're asking, are there descendants of the
Yeah.
gods
Hmm.
today?
Hmm.
Yes. Well, yeah, I think so. I think definitely so. And those who claim to be say so.
Uh-huh.
Not always in plain language, but maybe in taciturn language and imagery and how they position themselves as the Elim or the elite.
Hmm.
The I am plural that I use for the giants, as opposed to ite. So that's why I did a sort of play on words, Elim and elite.
Hmm.
I am is a majestic suffix used in multiple ancient countries for this bloodline of the gods. And so that's why we see it with the seraphim, the serpent ones. We see it with the cherubim, the four-faced ones, the Ophanim. And that gets passed down in that royal lineage to pure blood, hybrids, but pure from the first human they mate with the god or the fallen angel. So you will have Nephilim,
Hmm.
the giant ones. You'll have Rephaim, the
Hmm.
giant ones. You'll have, Avim. You'll have Anakim. You will have Horim. These are all biblical ones using that I am plural that shows up in the Bible. And so all of those giant names derive from, and the tribes are named eponymously, so after a patriarch. And all of those words go back to a singular form. So Rapha for Raphaim, Nephil for Nephilim.
Hmm.
Um, so Horim would be Hori. Um, so, and not in the plural. So if you go the same way with the Rephaim, and we get a Rephaim tribe of giants that are described in Genesis 14 and 15, That's what I mean by they re received that name from a specific patriarch, Rapha. Rapha is one of the names of Baal. Baal creates the RPM, Rephaim, as that comes through in transliterated Hebrew into English. Um, he creates the Rephaim after the flood with other Baalim of the Baalim Council. And so we get the same words that come out of the same original Semitic that Hebrew comes from in the Ugaritic text, where we have a direct relationship there. So, like Raphaim, for example, its source word is Rapha 7495, meaning to heal.
Mhm.
So when you have Raphael as a meaning, that means healer of God or God heals, right?
Mhm.
In the original Hebrew. And so when we look at the source word of Rapha, it spins off several other words. One would be 7496, which is a disembodied spirit, a demon spirit of the Rapha or Raphaim,
Mhm.
demons, as we would know them from a monotheist lens. They would be more as spirit guides or whatever from a polytheist um, perspective. And 7497 is the Rapha word giant. And then when you have talking idols that are talked about in the Bible and talked about in polytheism, images that somehow can hold a disembodied spirit and are called family idols that speak to you. So we're talking about a technology to be able to do this because, just a rock or piece of wood's not going to cut it. To be the oikotarian or the dwelling place for the word, that's teraphim. That word is also sourced back to Rapha. Now, in the Ugaritic text, these kings are called, as we get it transliterated, Rapiu or Rapium. RPM in the original Semitic. Gibborim is a tribe there, and mighty ones are also used as GBR and Gibborim, which also describes giants in the Bible. So you see the connection for the mighty ones to the giants, and as you take that back to the original sort of language, and they were known as not only giants, but also the kings and dynastic kings with the genealogy of their dynasties and also healers. They could actually heal themselves originally and others. So that's why you have to take a head,
Mhm.
because if you don't, they can repair most other injuries. But with taking the head,
Oh.
they have not the ability to repair that. So that brings back sort of the Highlander sort of series of there can only be one and they take their heads. And that's a
Mhm.
fairy matriarchal allegory versus the dragon patriarchal allegories that they're using in that entertainment. And in the Egyptian execration texts, the worst death you could have as a royale, and royale is kings of God, as you take that back in its etymology, right?
Yeah.
Um, the worst death you could have is to lose your head. So for their nemesis rivals, they would do that, A, because they wanted to keep them dead, right?
Mm.
And these are the terrible ones that seem to be in the pit prison, in the sides of the pit in Ezekiel 32, called the terrible ones, that are also in there with the strong L, as in angels that are in the pit prison. Uh, and if you want to get a better description of some of how some of these giant or some of these angels look, go to Pistis Sophia. I don't have the chapter number memorized, but I think 126, if my memory serves me right. And it's going to describe these rulers in the pit prison with all of these different faces. So you're going to have you're going to have serpent faces, dog faces, bear faces. And again, biblically, we don't get all the descriptions of what these gods or fallen angels look like. We only get some.
Mhm.
And there's many different orders and ranks of the angels. So that's why it's such an interesting sort of parallel account for somebody to want to have a look at, because they're in this prison that the Bible talks about, and
Well,
it's a Gnostic gospel.
so, and are they geneticists? Are these beings
Well, they could
geneticists?
be in part.
Yeah.
They could be in part
Hmm.
because it's one thing to create something that looks similar to you in a hybrid species,
Hmm.
but when you get into chimera as we understand it today and what they're doing with that science. And as we understand it,
Mm,
how it was applied, they created beings that had multiple species that you can't account for unless they had DNA capability. They still had to supply the life force for the spirit.
mhm,
So there's still that sexual sort of connection, which is why they're all connected to a sexual birth between a god or a fallen angel. But if you look at like the terrible one in the book of Gilgamesh, the
mhm,
Epic of Gilgamesh, his name is King Hababa. There's several different transliterations and whichever one that you're talking about, but he has a special status. And Gilgamesh and Enkidu are on their way over to kill him, and they actually kill him, which is why Enkidu has to die because Hababa was living in the cedar forest at Mount Hermon. Um,
mm,
the central mountain for ancient history, at least from a Middle East perspective. Nippur, as it would have been understood in Sumerian, and where the Council of the Gods and the Ring Lords were provided kingships before the flood, just as after the flood, you have Baal ruling there,
mhm,
and the assembly of the Tanu, giant tribes in the Ugaritic texts that received their authority to rule there.
mhm.
Um, but you have King Ababa that has multiple parts, and his commission was to do horrible things to humankind. That's what he was created to do. He's he's called the Terrible One, which I think is the an inspiration for some of the KGV translators to use for a team for the terrible ones as they translate that in Ezekiel 32, because these were no different than other giants in terms of who they are and who's being described, except that they do some horrible things. So I think they're using that terrible one
Mhm.
description that Hababa was described as to apply to these ones because they have a higher level of evil as well than other giants. Because only the terrible ones go to the pit prison. The other ones remain as disembodied spirits. Polytheist version would be they had their heads chopped off, which is probably why they had to go there. But as of if in
Mm,
terms of their rituals are designed to have them to find their way back to the gods in that heaven, which is in the earth in Hades or Sheol or the other world, but not to the pit prison that's also located there. But
mm,
in for example, Baal would go back and forth between Hades or Sheol and Earth every day through the gateway of Hades at Mount Hermon, right? Because he would oversee both the Earth that he was chief god over
mm.
and Hades.
So Mount Hermon is where the 200 fallen angels landed, right?
Correct. And that's where they swore the oath to create the giants and to carry it out to the end. So harem anathema actually is Hebrew word,
Hmm.
and harem is Cherem, and it means curse or accursed. So what's interesting in anathema is this ecclesiastical denunciation that they're going to carry it out, and it's not a forgivable denunciation, that they're going to carry this out to create these giants to destroy humankind, no matter the consequences.
And
And then they're going to do it
why the
again.
hatred of humankind? And also, do you think Mount Hermon was chosen because it is a stargate or something? Like why there? And why the
Well, I
hatred
mean,
of
there's portals
humans?
to the other world. There's
Okay.
portals to the other world.
Yeah.
Gilgal Raphaim has over 100 domens. Domen means portal.
Okay.
Is part of the polytheist technology and understanding. It's part of the doctrine. And
Hmm.
even the giants could go back in the Ugaritic texts back between both worlds.
Hmm.
So again, everything starts to make a little bit more sense if we, put some of the pieces together here. So when we look at Mount Hermon, it had its name changed to Hermon because Hermon, Hermanim, as it's in Hebrew, um, because there's three peaks, it's a plural, is rooted in Haram. And so the original name that Mount Hermon is called in the Ugaritic text is Mount Saphon. And
Oh,
we're also told, yeah, so the name is changed to memorialize that curse, right? That oath.
wow.
And so biblically, we're told in other cultures that Mount Hermon was named Sirion, Shinir, and you'll like this one, Sion, Sion, as in Deuteronomy 4.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and again, that just opens up a whole bunch more doors as to, okay, well, how's that connect to like organizations like the Priory of Sion? Was that a holy mountain? And it's a different word than Zion, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a
Mm-hmm.
Mount Zion in Jerusalem, and then this one is a different word. And I would say that the angels took that mountain because they have control over the world
Mm-hmm.
and legal rights on it
Mm-hmm.
through the Council of Gods, and that they took one of God's holy mountain and swore that curse there. And in the end time, biblically, God's going to take his holy mountain back, and that's where Armageddon's going to be fought, the mountain of assembly, Moed, and that this holy mountain is a play on words that is used for some interesting organizations that led to the creation of the Knights Templar, that led to the creation of the Rosicrucians, that led to the creation of all the modern secret societies that we have today in the West. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it is, and it's probably going to be used by both sides in the end time and play a special role in the end time. So when we look at Mount Hermon, we should look at this in a special way and maybe ask a few questions. Why would the UN have control over Mount Hermon?
I was just gonna say, because I've researched Mount, I'm fascinated by this, by the way. Um, there used to be some kind of a rock with a saying written on it from when the fallen got there. That's gone. The UN is there. It's completely taken over by the military. This is something was left there that tells us more, and we have no access to it. There's, a few accounts about it, but you probably know more about this.
Yeah, I think, you have a portal that probably goes to the other um,
Hmm.
dimension. And you also have like the Pan Temple that was right beside the gateway to Hades there.
Yes.
And, that was this white dome building, kind of like the White House, right?
Hmm.
And government buildings. And you have other temples there as well, but like I say, it has a special place around the world. I'm not saying there aren't other holy mountains. In fact,
Hmm.
there seems to be a constant of up to seven, maybe eight holy mountains, depending on how you want to separate the top seven gods from Satan, that would, from a monotheist perspective, that would sit above that with his consort.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, just as he sits above the council of gods,
Hmm.
just because he wants to be like God. So I'm not saying there isn't different antediluvian civilizations. I think there were multiple ones.
Hmm.
And they may have each had a holy mountain. As you look at the 70 nations, that the gods have control over. And then you look at the chief of tens that's talked about in terms of the angelic hierarchy in the book of Enoch, and you have this top seven, which seems to be a worldwide constant. They may be over, the 70 nations, right? As you put that 10 and the seven together. So none of this is coincidence. And when we look at the covenant land, that's important too, because all of the lands were awarded to these 70 gods to rule over the earth. And we get that number biblically with the
Mm-hmm.
70 patriarchs in Genesis 10,
Mm-hmm.
although nine are patriarchless, but that's a different rabbit hole. But and we get that numbered by the number of Israel, or the number of Jacob's sons born in Egypt, 70 as well. So we get a confirmation to the number. And it's the same number as with Adam's descendants
Hmm.
in Deuteronomy 32. And but everybody says, well, but Israel wasn't before the flood. And in fact, they were just forming as a nation in the time of Deuteronomy 32. So why is it Israel? Well, what's interesting is in the Septuagint it says angels there, and in the Aramaic translation it says sons of God. And everybody says, well, how can that be? Well, if you look at the MO of how the Bible works, it's giving you important prehistory here,
Mm-hmm.
information for the time of Moses and the land that he's being given, and that the 70 angels, you know, rule over those, but the covenant land was reserved for God that he's giving to Israel, where the giants have moved in waiting for Israel to be formed and come about. And that in the millennium, in the future, you're going to have the sons of Israel numbered and as patriarchs sitting over the nations in the millennium, ruling from Jerusalem. So this is what I call like a dual prophecy that I call in book two, for lack of a better name, where it gives you important prehistory information and a prophecy for the time of the prophet, in this case Moses, and then an unfulfilled part in the end time. And if you start to understand that, then you might dig into a little bit deeper into the name Israel that Jacob has his name changed to. And that's a compound word. And so the original Hebrew in ancient times, that would have meant as Sarah and El.
Mm-hmm.
And so Sarah means ruler or a prince, and El means a god. So you would use ruler for, I think, the translation in there, even though you can call the archangels princes, um, just as Michael's a prince, for example. So the translation of that is ruling God or the
Mm-hmm.
mighty God. And the Hebrew there is Ben Israel or Ben Sarah. So this is the sons of the ruling God. This is the
Mm-hmm.
same term, sons of God, that's used in the Council of Gods, sons of the Most High in Psalms 82, the same term that's used in Genesis 6 to create the giants, the same thing that you use to call angels in Job 1 6 and 2 1 when they present themselves before God that Satan tags along with. And these are the ones that are celebrating at the point of creation with the morning star order of angels in Job 38, 4 through 7 that I talked about earlier. So all of a sudden, now the passage makes perfect sense in what the Septuagint is saying, what the KJV says, and what the Aramaic translations say and translate as sons of God, that it's for both. It's before the flood, it's the time of Moses, and for the millennium.
And that's what we're seeing fulfilled because that's who is
Yes.
behind all these powers. But where does the king list, the
Yeah.
Sumerian king list, fit into this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, um, when we look at a merging of ancient history, I think we have an Eastern version and we have a more Western version, let's say, of the Middle East area.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when we get the King's List coming out of Sumeria, that would be more the Eastern version.
Mm-hmm.
Um, with the Gnostics and the secret societies, they're kind of pooling global polytheist religions into one greater religion and trying to bring it back home to the original Zoroastrian religion or Enochian mysticism of the antediluvian epoch that crosses the flood. So we need to sort of understand that. So the Sumerian kings list is talking about all demigods
Mm-hmm. Okay.
that were kings. right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
None of them are humans, but
Mm-hmm.
they're demigods. And the Nephilim or Zayazudra is the Noah, only a giant Noah that is going to repopulate giants in that version after the flood. Not saying that's the only way they have giants showing up after the flood, because Gilgamesh is created by Nin and King Lugabanda of Uruk after the flood, sixth generation, and so is Enkidu created by Nin or Ninsun, depending on which transliteration you're reading, and that's a second incursion as well. So
Mm-hmm.
offspring gods creating and maybe survival somehow, some way on an ark in another dimension. However, the gods or the fallen angels help them to survive. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
some show up again after the flood as well, but they give both accounts. And so when we look at that king's list, that is that direct genealogy of those demigods, which a lot of the royals will say that's how we get our genealogies back to before the flood. And then the ennobling of giants that were created after the flood by the parent gods. And so, from a Gnostic perspective, you have a merging of that king's list with Cain's descendants.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the right now, and they're going to supply also the wives to create the demigods, but they look at two different creations of the giants, not just the ones in Genesis 6. The Gnostic accounts describe two creation of giants. Biblically, we only get one.
Mm-hmm.
So, but in this case, they also look at Cain as not being the direct son of Adam and Eve. And that Cain, and you get this in the Lilith accounts coming out of the mysticism that come back with Judaism that we know as Kabbalism
Mm-hmm.
versus Essenism, which is the Western Egyptian version of polytheism within Judaism from the Therapeutate. Um, but in their account, you have Satan, Samael,
Mm-hmm.
in his seraphic form, now having sex with Eve in Eden. So this is the serpent seed concept that's talked about in Christianity, but it's also standard doctrine in Gnosticism that it's either Satan or multiple archons that are raping Eve to produce Cain, whichever one becomes the father, and he becomes now a giant.
Mm-hmm.
I don't I'm not dead set against that. I can't get there biblically
Mm-hmm.
because the allegory and the twists and turns to get there just is a little bit too much for me, but I'm not totally against it. And when it says Adam and Eve, you know, acquired or were given, however you want to translate the word kana, which is the root word for Cain, as to be acquired, people will point to that and say, well, it wasn't their son. It was given to them or was produced by somebody other than Adam as the father, in this case, a fallen angel. So that's how the Gnostics get there with the first giant creation. They also have an allegorical version that looks like Amakaseth as this greater being, and not Seth of the Seth line, but as the created in a little bit differently, created in fact similarly to how the centaurs are created by Hera in a cloud. So Amaka Seth is also created in a cloud as a superior being, and then is transplanted again after the flood as well. So you have two different beginnings to the giants, one with Amaka Seth that somehow survives the flood, and then you have also other giants that are created in Genesis 6 that may not survive the flood, but do show up somehow again after the flood. So in the Gnostic accounts, they look at Sodom and Gomorrah as cities of light and as ancient cities before the flood. So the giants were planted at Gomorrah before the flood and then replanted at Sodom after the flood in those accounts. And
Wow.
again, we have all of these interesting accounts of Sodom in the Bible and the five cities of the plain that are destroyed by fire, which
Mm-hmm.
again, Jesus uses in his analogy of the days of Noah, as recorded in Luke, that not only the end time is going to be like the days of Noah, but like the days of Lot. and that's destruction by fire. That's a transition from apocalypse of water to the real apocalypse of fire that's coming, that was there in the beginning that we talked about earlier. And in this account, you have two angels who take a bodily form, who come with Jehovah of the Elohim to visit with Abraham, and then the two angels go on to Sodom and Gomorrah, and they're having this discussion, and that the inhabitants want to have them come out and have sex with them. And typically, from a monotheist perspective, it's looked at that would be homosexual sex. But is that really the case? This is the place where giants were originally created by after the flood in the second incursion, according to the Gnostics. This is a Pentapolis set of city states that are ruled over by Rephaim kings, and they're having this fertility issue. So, are they wanting these angels that they know that can have changeling capabilities? Are they saying that they want to have sex with the daughters, or are they saying that they want them to change their form and that the males can have sex with them? Just as King
Mm.
Lugobanda and the fertility goddess Nin produced Gilgamesh. So they know both are going on there. And those crimes that are talked about in Sodom are the same crimes as Jude 1:6 and 2 Peter 2 talks about that were done before the flood.
Wow.
So now you have to say, well, what is the meaning of that conversation? And it could mean all of the above interpretations that were going on. But there is a definite splitting of the way in terms of how monotheists would look at Sodom,
Hmm.
and that polytheists would look at Sodom. Those were cities of knowledge, cities of light. Those were cities, and these great cities were built on a hill.
Hmm.
That's where you built those fortresses for protection. And we see that sort of allegorized in King Arthur with Camelot.
Hmm.
Lot being in there, Cam meaning this curved light, and a shining city or fortress on a hill where Camelot was located. That would be an allegorical Gnostic city of light. So when they call Washington, D.C., the city of light, what are they really saying?
Well, because the story that they want you to believe is always that they were cities of sin, right? That's the
Yeah.
version, and that's why they were destroyed. Like, and the other thing that I
And
wonder,
there and there were
mm,
and there but light in Gnosticism is knowledge
right?
and technology.
So what's
And
the
so cities of light from a polytheist perspective would not only be good, but cities of knowledge, cities of
right?
technology, and developing the same type of technology that would have been developed before the flood, and
Right.
have a similar type of apocalyptic type of destruction applied to them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that knowledge is bad, it's how, because knowledge can be used for good
Mm-hmm.
or evil. It's how
Mm-hmm.
knowledge is applied that is the real sort of defining nature of it. Unfortunately, we always tend to use knowledge for evil, but
Well, and it reminds me of the Tower of Babel, right?
yeah,
And
it's exactly the same thing.
so who are the lineage of Cain today? What area of
Well,
the
from a
world?
monotheist, yep. So from a monotheist perspective, there would be no descendants of Cain.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Cain did intermarry from a monotheist. I'll get to the polytheist perspective in a
Mm-hmm.
second. Now, we don't get told biblically who the wives are on the ark.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so the wives, from a monotheist perspective, likely represent the four races
Mm-hmm.
and pure descendants of the people of day six as three of those races, assuming that Adam and Eve, which would be the fourth, is a different race of the four,
Mm-hmm.
and that there was no DNA deterioration for the wives because they would have been pure as well, and they would have been following the God of the Bible to be on the ark and the Noah tradition. So that's how we get descendants after the flood. But from a polytheist perspective, you have Cain surviving the flood, or not Cain surviving the flood, Cain's descendants surviving the flood.
Mhm.
People like Tubal-Cain, for example, just as we saw in the last Noah movie, is the one to depict of hanging onto the ark that in Jewish
Mhm.
mystical accounts isn't Tubal-Cain, it's Og, it's the last of the Rephaim from before the flood, as they
Mhm.
would understand that. But same stories, whoever you want to have as that individual.
Mhm.
But lots of accounts around the world have giants surviving the flood, as we talked about a few, Deucalion and Pyrrha. Deucalion is the Greek Noah, son of Prometheus, so he's a giant, not a human. He's a demigod. But around the world, you also have accounts of humans from day six surviving, whether it's on a mountain, on a log, on an ark, helped by the ant people into the earth. However, they survive. Polytheists have a different way of how those day six people would survive into the flood. But no matter what, the DNA comes across. And I think that's why we see that DNA in the analysis over time as being not just beginning with something different with eight people. You don't see that
Mhm.
division. You see more of a continuum with that. From a so from the polytheist account,
Can we just,
Cain was this.
Gary, can we just, sorry, take 2 minutes? I
Yep,
just have to go to the bathroom.
sure.
Okay.
Yep, and so polytheism has lots of different ways that humans are going to survive the flood, and they're told all around the story. And I cover a lot of those different areas off in book one. And then I also cover another area off that I develop more in book two, because we have some of these strange peoples that show up in the Bible after the flood that we don't have patriarchs for.
Mm.
And yeah, so that's okay. Well, so who are they, where did they come from? And people might say, well, who's he talking about? Well, the two that are the most relevant to the conversation would be the Kenites and the Kenizzites.
Mm.
And they predate names that you would attribute to a patriarch downstream. They show up before. So we have these individuals showing up in Genesis 15 in the land. I call them the triple K. There's also the Cadmonites as well.
Ooh.
Um, and they show up in Genesis 15 in the land that God is awarding to Abraham, the same land that was in Eden, where it's Mount Hermon to the Sea Aqaba on the Red Sea in the south, from the Nile River to the Euphrates rivers. And in that land, not only are there people like the Rephaim, you have the Kenizzites, the Kenites, and the Cadmonites that we don't have patriarchs for, and the Perizzites.
Ooh.
And so you kind of, so all biblically, how do you get there? So when I look at that word Kenite and Kenizzite, and they're quite related, and they were related to tribes, that etymology and source wording in Hebrew goes back to the word Cain.
Ha, 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 ha.
And these were smiths, like Cain was a smith, master at smithing. And so in book one, I kind of leave that as being they're possible, humans that survive, only descended from Cain. Now, if you're of the belief that they were demigods anyways, it's kind of the same thing. But if you're believing that that Cain wasn't a demigod, then you still have this other bloodline from the antediluvian epoch that is showing up after the flood. It's interesting is they show up in the Ugaritic texts as well in the original Semitic form, then you get transliterated, but the original for Cadmonite would be KDM. And you would have uh, Q and Y for the Kenites. And these are Ben Q N Y, B N and B E N, so sons of
Oh.
Kenite, sons of Cadmus, which is a name that
Mhm.
shows up in Greek mythology from the Cadmon. And so these are created by the Baalim Council after the flood. So these could be giants as well. Um,
And that's for
but these,
they're creating these lineages because they have a plan in mind, and they don't care if it
yeah,
takes a couple thousand or a few thousand years to complete.
yeah, and yeah, and for the fallen angels, they got very, very close
Hmm.
to the goal just before the flood. You
Mm.
had asked the question that I didn't get to. Why do they have such venom and hatred towards humankind?
Hmm.
It's their destiny. So if we go back to what we talked about a little bit earlier about the angelic rebellion and that Satan, Lucifer wants to be like God, to rule in his own realm like God,
Hmm.
likely not able to defeat him, and he's immortal anyway. So unless you're going to find a way to lock him away, somewhere in a pit-like prison that could hold it, the God Most High, then um, he's looking for a diplomatic peace settlement to live in his own realm,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And so they're in this position now that God creates the Adamites for a special commission, and Jehovah Elohim actually breathes into them to give them that life. And now he's going to work with them on an intimate level all the way through the Old Testament, as part of the resolution to the angelic rebellion. So the angels know that these Adamites are being created, and if they don't do something about it, the destiny is, and as we're told in the New Testament, is that we're going to be raised up to be like angels, even though we have human fathers, and to be inheritors of eternity.
Hmm. Hmm.
Well, what is going on with the interrelationship here is the fallen angels do not want to serve us in eternity,
Hmm.
and that they don't want to be part of God's laws and God's realm going forward. And the only way that they're going to win this peace agreement or this settlement is that if they lead humankind to destroy themselves and rebel from God, it justifies their rebellion.
Hmm. Hmm.
So what they're not going to do is bring the power of God to play if they don't have to,
Hmm.
right? They don't want to challenge that. They already challenged that. They'll challenge it again in the end time.
Hmm.
And again, depending on which belief system you're on, who's going to win that. But staying with the analogy is that if that power of God is so great, you're not going to challenge that directly. So you're going to create offspring to do the dirty work for you to get blood on their hands. And the angels will say, well, yes, but we didn't do it. Right.
Yeah.
And so the giants are created to not only enslave humankind, but to destroy them from the face of the earth. And they don't really care about their offspring.
Hmm.
They're
Hmm.
only concerned, we don't want to go to the lake of fire.
Hmm.
And so they're using the royales and the giants to bring that about so that we destroy ourselves from the face of the earth and justify their rebellion, and they would win another realm. Now, in the polytheist belief system, they would get that realm, and that the demonic disembodied spirits would receive new oiketerians in that new world. And in that account, we get accounts like Zoroaster and Maitreya. Um, Maitreya out of Zoroastrianism, sorry, uh, correct myself, and Shiva would be the another equivalent, but it's the same religion. You have to understand Zoroastrianism is the root for Gnosticism and
Hmm.
is the Western branch of the Sanskrit Hinduism, because the Indo-Aryans, the giants after the flood, they went into Persia and into the Indus Valley. And that's why in Zoroastrianism, you have gods that are spelled almost the same way, just like a dialect difference in spelling. And it's the same religion. So when we look at, the Shiva that comes about, it's more of a built on other beings that were before the flood. It's like for some reason Shiva has this coming out of nowhere in this transformation to be like Maitreya. which in Sanskrit and in um, Indo-Aryan, Proto-Indo-Aryan, language of the giants,
Mm.
means a covenant. So that word
Mm.
mitra is the covenant that is kind of has a connection to Antichrist in the end time, creating the 7-year covenant. Now, who Mitra is one of the main gods of Zoroastrianism. It's the founder of the branch Mithraism in Italy and in Rome, um, and is really Zoroastrianism. Mitra uh, is the same angel that the Templars worshipped, Baphomet, Father Mitra, which is Azazel as a goat
Oh.
god, as we would understand that um, from the book of Enoch, and why they also honor Azazel in the same way as the one who brought them that illicit knowledge.
Mm.
And this is Lord Maitreya. That's the allegory for the Antichrist in the Vedas and in Gnosticism and Theosophy, and probably even used into New Age. And what Mithra does is like what Shiva does, comes at the end of the age to destroy the world by fire, but renews that earth after the fire. So now you start to see Age of Aquarius and all
Mhm.
sorts of other things, and the fire destruction of the Bible. That's all talking about the same event, different outcomes, but the same prophesied sort of events. And so Mitra was an avatar, just as Vishnu's an avatar, just as Shiva is an avatar. And what I mean by that is the older understanding of that, and I had to get into sources, that go back well before the 1800s to
Mm.
get the distinction modeled here. And so Vishnu would be the avatar, and Buddha, just as Lord Maitreya is understood as the new Buddha and Antichrist for the end time from a monotheist perspective. Vishnu was the avatar of the Avatara Buddha, who provided Buddha the wisdom. So just as Vishnu incarnated, which is the term used in the New Age for Christ consciousness,
Mhm.
um, many times, probably up to 20 times, Shiva also did the same thing. And if Shiva is the destroyer god, a bad Napoleon Azazel, and comes up out of the pit prison and is somehow connected to Antichrist in monotheist prophecy, is the one who comes up out of the pit prison. Now we have an avatar effect going on with Lord Maitreya or Antichrist, and Lord Maitreya will act as an avatar, as a Christ consciousness in the end time. So you see this complete emergence out of the ancient religions and the understanding into what the Bible is talking about. So no matter what somebody's belief system is, you can't have these types of coincidences that show up all over the world that aren't supposed to have any connection, that talks about the same things from the beginning to the end time. That's not mathematically probable.
Mm-mm. No, no. This is the same long endured agenda, like the very patiently, working towards this. So these beings would have to live a very long time to fulfill
Yeah, the
this.
fallen angel. I mean, they are immortal, and that's the only way that this can continue. And they have to, continue with new offspring. One would sort of deduce out of that. So what's interesting about Zoroaster is it has a very similar um, mythos to it as what Hermes Trismegistus does in the Western polytheist side. And it's Hermes, because you were mentioning Nimrod and Babel, or didn't say Nimrod, but Babel earlier, that knowledge is going to be used at with Babel and building possibly a Stargate, like when we can go there if you want. But he delivers the knowledge of the antediluvians to Nimrod. in the Polychronicon and the history of Freemasonry, and that was buried under the Great Pyramid. Now, there's
Whoa.
Christmas, yeah, and the religion that they were utilizing, which is why Nimrod is associated with polytheist religions, because that's the religion he implemented, and with the knowledge that he received, and is an archetypical biblical character as an archetype for Antichrist, because he has complete sway over humanity, the Noahites, and a universal religion on them, and he struts like an Antichrist figure. Um, and how you get there is this great knowledge that I said was what we're just catching up to is what he gets. So he's now building Babel City and Babel Tower to go into heaven. Well, you can't build mud bricks or rock bricks to go interdimensionally or
Mhm.
even get out of the firmament. I mean, you'd have
Yeah.
to be a lunatic or a madman to do that. But if he's trying to build a technology that can create a portal and understand a tower, pyramid, and ziggurat were understood as the same buildings with same types of capabilities, well, maybe he's trying to build a portal. And so in the Akkadian version of the Tower of Babel, and there's a Sumerian version as well, and one in Central America, there's Armenian versions. There's lots of accounts of Babel around the world. But in the Akkadian version, they don't use the word Babel, they use Babalu. ILU is a transliteration of EL, or an IL, and AL is in Baal as in Lord God. And they don't look at the word meaning confusion of languages. They look as Bab is translated as a gateway or a portal. And as ILU is a god in Sumeria. So this is a stargate or a portal of the gods. So Nimrod, when he's threatening God that if you try and bring something like the flood again, I'm going to go into heaven and slay you.
Mhm.
Well, now you understand he just might be trying to build a technology that could do that. And only Antichrist is reserved to be able to do this. And in Daniel 8:10, Antichrist actually goes into heaven and throws down some of the starry host and tramples on them at the midpoint of the last 7 years. This is the same timing as he comes to power in Revelation. And in Revelation 12, when Satan and his angels storm heaven in the war in heaven. But Nimrod's not permitted to do that. Only Antichrist is going to be permitted to do that, which is why God intercedes to confuse the languages. And the other place he just might want to go is into Hades or Sheol to the pit prison and let out all of those gods, offspring and parent gods who created the demigods, the giants, just like they're released in the end time just before the midpoint of the last 7 years. So there's a connection there. But back to the Trismegistus, because it's Hermes who delivers this information. There's three different Hermes, and there's two different versions of the Trismegistus with two individuals before the flood, one individual after, or one individual before the flood, two after. So Hermes is kind of a constant at the time of Babel, but in when there's two after the flood, there's an Egyptian one that would be more associated with alchemy in and then there would be a god that would be or a priest that would be associated before the flood, which typically we would understand through the Gnostics as Enoch, son of Cain, would be that individual who developed mysticism, developed the knowledge that merged with the gods, and recorded all of this knowledge and buried it under the pyramid so that it could be found to be taken across. And that how Hermes finds this, he finds a pillar, and they create two pillars before the flood to store this knowledge. Or to store the information where to find the knowledge. One is designed to, and you're going to like this, survive a flood or float. And the other one is to survive a destruction by fire because they don't know which one's coming. So now, if we understand this God as either Enoch evolving into be a god, just as third Enoch talks about him as being renamed as Metatron in doing so. You get back to a godlike individual like Mercury or Thoth are all thought to be related to Enoch, son of Cain, in the Gnostic accounts. Or there's a god who provides the knowledge, and then he creates a priesthood beginning with Enoch. That's how you would have a god or an individual. And there's, like I say, there's two different individuals, but how it now connects with the Eastern division of Zoroaster is that there's several Zoroasters. So there's one that's about, 600 BC. There is one that's just after the flood, and there's one that's before the flood. So similar to two after the flood. So the one that's after the flood is actually thought in some accounts, and even some of the church fathers, um, related it back to Ham as being the progenitor of this knowledge after, as Chem or Ham, because Ham is spelled Cham. So as we would transliterate that as Chem Zarathustra would be his title and would be the first priest. Other accounts would associate that as being a giant after the flood, who may be one of the seven sages as a priest class that's providing the knowledge after the flood. And then you would have another one that typically Zoroastrian is equated with about 600 BC. Um, but there's also one before the flood. And his his name isn't Zoroaster. Zoroaster is in Proto-Indo-Aryan comes from Zara, which means dawn or an aurora or shining, and aster, which means a star or an angel. So that's where the name, so that's almost like a shining star.
Mm-hmm.
Well, who else in polytheism is thought about as a shining star?
Lucifer.
Lucifer is. Yeah, as the morning star. So interesting sort of connection. But the name of the individual before the flood comes down as Gaelmard. And he was a giant, and he was the first to accept Ahura Mazda before the flood and the knowledge. And this is the knowledge that comes down and is passed on to this first generation, whoever he is, as a Zoroaster after the flood, and probably takes the name as part of that title, just as the church fathers and the Gnostics both look at Ham as being a Chem's Zarathustra. But again, what the true allegory means to that, who knows? But um, there seems to be one that's associated with the giant after the flood. And of course, the Gnostics believe Ham was a giant. So again, you can see kind of how they get there. Um, and it's not for me to decide. I have biases. I lean from the monotheist side, but
Mm-hmm.
I try and connect dots and provide information for people and let them decide. But no matter what, this seems to be the same mythos that's talked about with Hermes Trismegistus.
And so, would you say from these ancient um, orders that were created for this hidden knowledge, would that be what these secret societies that we have today are connected to essentially?
Yeah, they're saying they have a lot of this ancient knowledge that they've collected and they're saving it for a specific time.
Hmm.
Um, and who knows, a lot of that knowledge, I mean, that knowledge is going to be at Oak Island on First Nation reserves as it got moved to after Oak Island. They would have many locations around the world to keep this knowledge or technology,
Hmm.
but don't overlook the source either, which is the Great Pyramid. And all of a sudden, everything's gone quiet again about these great discoveries that were just found under the pyramid of these huge chambers.
Hmm.
Um, that is, I'm watching to see whether or not we're going to get any more information on that because it is a interesting time period we're living in, and they may be starting to get ready to reveal more of the ancient technology. and our history as we get closer to um, the New World Order and one world government. And what they would like to do is to create this universal religion again,
Hmm.
that goes back to the ancient religions. So um, we'll have to wait and see what happens on that. But there's just too much of connections to the ancient times for us not to understand what happened in prehistory, so we can help understand where things are going.
Today, yeah. Would you say that the
Yeah.
pyramid, with what, with what has been discovered, and I'll have to put a picture for people here. Would you say that that was built prior to the flood, prior to this all?
Oh, I think so.
Hmm.
Yeah. So what we get is this a pablum that it was built by Khufu and Khafre,
Mm,
pharaohs, in about 2300 BC, and use some plausible datings with them. And that would be a date that would be more in line with the biblical start of the post-Diluvian area,
hmm.
after the flood. But the secular one that they have would have us more like 600 years before that. But nonetheless, that's the date the Egyptologists and the seculars would have us believe, except that, there's a stellar of Menes in Narma, that's dated to about 3000 BC and before the flood in
Hmm.
his list of kings, um, as it comes out of Egypt, and it's showing this 52.5-degree Great Pyramid in the background. So
Hmm.
I,
Hmm.
th I, and when we look at all of the information that comes with the Great Pyramid and its other sister pyramids, this is a technology we can't do today.
Oh God,
This
no.
is a techno We can't do the masonry, we can't move the blocks, and to have it align with Earth ratios, to have it aligned with celestial um, constellations and stars, to have sacred geometry, all sorts of things into is not explained to us in an intelligent manner. It's just sort of brushed aside,
Hmm.
that somehow it's coincidence that they could do all of this, and they never give you an explanation that's plausible. And we can't do this today. And we have these sites that are built all around the world. Like, how did Machu Picchu City get built?
Hmm.
Well,
Hmm.
I mean, we can't do that today, but it's just so many of these. So what's interesting again is in the Masonic accounts. Um, you have a history that this knowledge to build the Great Pyramid was developed by Enoch, son of Cain. And that's the knowledge that was used. And some people will say, and they use giants to help build it, but if they had that angelic technology, they don't need strongmen to do it. They would
Hmm.
just have it using like anti-gravity or something like that and moving it into place, right?
Yeah.
But they would have to have the technology to cut the stones and stuff like that. So their belief is it's antediluvian and that it's related to this ancient knowledge. And the Enoch story, because again, they have layers and layers and layers of um, allegories in their meanings, could be just the superficial story that's hiding the real meaning
Right.
underneath in terms of who supplied this knowledge. So we have to be aware of that in terms of how polytheism works.
Hmm.
So when we look at their accounts that it was built before the flood, and I look at water erosion, which has to go back to almost 10,000 BC. Some people say 8,000 BC. It has to be older. Whenever somebody wants to date it, 4,000 BC is a typical one that a lot of the Gnostics will look at in terms of Andalusis and other connections that they'll make. Um, so it's antediluvian. I think there's no doubt about it. And you can't have that kind of knowledge and then all of a sudden have to build inferior pyramids later.
Yep.
And they say, well, the knowledge was lost. Well, you still haven't explained how they had the knowledge to do the first ones. So why
Exactly.
would I believe you that the knowledge was lost when you're saying they didn't have the knowledge to do it in the first place?
Exactly. So. Let me ask you, who is this God who is the one that is ruling and dictating and destroying Sodom and Gomorrah and the Tower of Babel? Who is this God that is dictating?
So when we look at the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, that's actually going to come through the authorization of Jehovah of the Elohim versus Elohim.
Hmm.
So understand that Elohim, singular El in the upper sense, El Elyon, God Most High, would be the name that Jesus uh, would probably use in a discussion in Hebrew to describe Abba, his father, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so there is a bit of a hierarchy, even though they're all in perfect harmony, but there is the Father, there
Hmm.
is the Word, there is the Spirit. Now, they are branches out of God Most High, which is why they're in sort of perfect harmony, but there's a distinction. I mean, Jesus prayed back to his Father.
Hmm.
He cried to his Father from the cross. There's a distinction. When we have the Holy Spirit present, it's away from God
Hmm.
and it's here. So there's a triune, there's a tripart nature, but El in the uppercase, Elyon
Hmm.
is the God Most High. El Shaddai would be another name, King of the Mountain or God of the Mountain. And he is this spiritual being
Hmm.
because everything in heaven is in a spirit nature that we have no idea what makes that up,
Hmm.
but is the one that has decided to create life and started with immortals.
Hmm.
But he describes himself as Alpha and Omega, knowing the beginning and the end. So when he created the immortals, he knew not all of them would stay loyal and did so anyways. And so with humans, we're created immortal without intimate knowledge of God and have to choose from a monotheist perspective on faith to follow God. And the reward is higher for that,
Hmm.
which is why we'll be raised higher through the adoption of Jesus than the gods or the fallen angels, which is why they didn't want to, the fallen ones did not want to, or do not want to have that happen. Unfortunately, they didn't know about for them, they didn't know about the resurrection, as First Corinthians talks about. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had Jesus crucified. Now, when we look at um, humans, though, I would caution humans, Adamites, is that we have a millennium period here where after 1,000 years, we're going to show we're no better than the fallen angels because Satan gets released and there's another war. And many of the descendants will follow Satan. So I think that's a humility sort of period for us. So what is God? I mean, we don't know. I mean, do
Hmm.
we know what his real name is? No. We
Hmm.
couldn't be able to pronounce it. We wouldn't be able to understand it. We get things presented to us in ways that we can understand it.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm sure even maybe I'm not even sure the angels or the gods could pronounce or um, translate the meaning of the word who we would look at as the God Most High. But the
Hmm.
terms we get are El, Elohim, El Elyon, El Shaddai, uh, as the Hebrew words that are associated with the God Most High.
Isn't Elohim plural?
It is. It is. And that's one of the interesting sort of things. So Elohim, when you see that in the lowercase, as we would understand that, that would imply from a monotheist perspective, gods,
Hmm.
G-O-D-S, because it can be translated as gods or angels, and or the God Most High. It all depends on the application.
Hmm.
Yes, so it is the plural form of El, and it is the male plural Elohim. Not that there's a gender in heaven.
Hmm.
The female plural is AH, so it would be Eloah
Mm.
in the Hebrew. And so when you have like Al as a transliteration of a god or an angel,
Mm.
um, the female form would be Allah. That doesn't necessarily mean a female goddess for Muslims that are out there. Um, it means, again, it's the application. So when you have the word um, Eloah used in Hebrew, that not doesn't necessarily mean a female goddess as well, but it could be. But typically, the AH is like a verb or an action to the application of the meaning of the word. So
Mm-hmm.
El can also mean mighty, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, as- and so when you have the word Gibor and Gibborim, you also have Gibberah, 1368 and 1369. Gibberah is also used in original Hebrew for the application of mighty, as opposed to being a mighty one. So
Mm.
you have to watch the female plural on that. So Allah could be, you could use that, sure, if you wanted to, as a female goddess
Mm-hmm.
that and say, well, that's what the Muslims are worshiping. Just as they say, well, that was the name of a polytheist god. It's
Mm-hmm.
generic, right? So you
Mm-hmm.
have to be careful with that. But it could also mean, the mighty God,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because
Interesting.
El can mean mighty, the strong God. So, and people will say, well, why don't they just use Elohim? Well, there's transliterations, there's different languages.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to be careful as Christians to say, well, they're not worshiping the God of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
You may disagree with how they worship, but I can tell you if you read the Quran, they believe they're worshiping the God of the Bible. Now, it may not be what is always taught in Islam in terms of that the Quran says that everything written in the Bible is accurate and it talks about Jesus as the Messiah and the Word of God and a whole bunch of other things that Christians don't want to know about either, that the Quran would talk about things in the same terms, but facts are facts.
Mm-hmm.
And so we want to be careful with the term Allah. And they say, well, some people might say, well, the Quran was received through Gabriel. Well, Gabriel is an important part of providing scripture to us as well. So as Christians, so again, we want to be a little bit more careful with that. And for the Christians that are out there saying, are you saying it's scripture? I'm saying we want to be careful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, I've read it. I don't find anything contradictory in there whatsoever, but we have to remember Ishmael um, is the son of Hagar, consort of Abraham, and was provided a covenant in the book of Galatians. It's a lower covenant than Sarah was provided. And if Israel, uh, through Sarah and Abraham, was provided scripture and had a covenant, would there be scripture provided for someone else from a covenant? Again, I can't answer that. I can only tell you what the Bible says,
Mm-hmm.
and that Jehovah, who did not personally go to see many individuals himself, presented himself to Hagar in the desert. There's a special connection there. So, and I'm not preaching, Chrislam or joining of the religions or anything. I'm just saying I was shocked when I read the Quran that I was hitting it hard in terms of critical analysis. And I was just absolutely stunned at the consistency.
Wow. So in this account, and I'm going to ask you the question about the lineages today and the lineages of the elite, the ruling classes. We're going to get back to where we are today. In this account, Lilith was originally the wife of Adam. She was replaced by what seems to me to be, again, geneticists working. And when I hear they took the rib from Adam and I hear created Eve, this to me seems like a clone. I don't know, but it seems like, well, where did Lilith go? Where's her lineage? Who are all the lineages connected to this account? And within the Genesis accounts, or the different creation accounts, we're suddenly getting these beings placed in a garden, and not just allowed to be in the world, almost like they were being
Yeah.
protected from whatever or whoever was outside the garden. So I know it's
Yeah, I
kind
think
of,
that a lot of that's accurate. Yeah.
mhm,
So Lilith is an interesting individual, and Lilith, as you understand that from the Sumerian history, um, is understood as the Queen of Heaven,
yeah.
but also almost in demigod status as well. So there might be more than one Lilith. There might be an angelic one and one and who receives a name similar because of the distinctions between um, the accounts of Lilith coming out of the Sumerian tradition. And Lilith also has a daughter named Lula Lilith,
Hmm.
who marries Cain in some accounts.
Hmm.
So that's kind of interesting too. So is Lilith then a offspring god? It seems likely,
Hmm.
although you could also take some accounts even before the flood. But offspring gods also lived before the flood. They just wouldn't have done the same crimes until after the flood. But Lilith is is very close to the matrilinear source of the royal bloodline in the Sumerian tradition. Who is the first? That's Tiamat. She's the first dragon queen. She is a
Yeah.
Leviathan female,
Yeah.
as we would understand that as Leviathan in the Bible and known by different names all around the world. For the same being that is killed in prehistory by a various god of the pantheon
Hmm.
or god of the Bible. So all the same story again, just different polytheist lands, like Indra and Verta would be the Sanskrit version. So
Hmm.
um, so as we look at that as the dragon bloodline of the seraphim angels, um, things start to make some sense. But it's the female side. So typically, you're not going to see that dragon allegory used for the matriarchal side. So it will sort of divert into a different allegory, but understand that these are seraphim at the source, and that the patriarchal side will take the dragon allegory, dragon and raven. Matriarchal will be owl and fairy. And so that's why you have like fairy queens, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so this dragon bloodline comes down in that belief system out of Sumeria, and the history that they have for it is that Lilith would have married Cain, not Cain, I'm sorry, Adam. So again, which one is this? Because if it's the fallen angel and the offspring is going to be Cain, as the Gnostics believe, then now you understand how they get to Cain as being a giant. Uh,
Hmm.
so this could be a fallen angel, and that first creation of the giants that we talked about, just from an Eastern tradition versus more of a Western Mediterranean tradition. Or it could be, a demigod. Certainly, you have the daughter of Lilith, Luala Lilith, I think is more accurate. That's also going to marry Cain. So now you're doubling down on the genetics of this bloodline in terms of that coming out of the Sumerian account.
Hmm.
Now, this may not be Cain. It may be somebody from Sumeria that they're talking about here that's been merged into the biblical account. So we want to be a little bit aware of that as well. So we get the we get the uh, Sumerian account being introduced into the Jewish account while the southern kingdom of Judah is in exile in Babylon. So there's no history of this before that. And while Judah is in Babylon in exile for 70 years, the nation of Judah is going to lose most of their language. Only the rabbis are going to maintain the original Hebrew. The international language of that time is Aramaic. And so what the Jewish rabbis do is they're now going to create a targum, and there's various targums, and they're mostly written originally in Aramaic, to have teachings for the Jewish people, but they're going to now put editorial comments into it. And it's at this time you get the entrance of the Lilith story into the Targum. And it gets brought back, and that's the source to the Kabbalistic sources that we have today versus the Egyptian sources that would be introduced through the Essenes. Um, so, is that accurate from a biblical account? Because they have, like the Garden of Dilmun, if I remember correctly, as the Garden of Eden with four rivers, and a very similar tradition as the Garden of Eden. So they just may be overlaying that into their belief system. And the Jewish people said, well, that sounds like the same account, and overlaid it into their accounts. But it's in the Targum and never officially gets into the Bible. So we want to be a little bit careful with that. But at the same time, we do not want to dismiss the Sumerian account because it could be, again, another separate account of either the same or a similar type of event.
Hmm. Yeah, and what of the Enuma Elish and the account of creation within this whole tapestry?
Yeah, I mean, again, you have the same sort of accounts as you have in Genesis 1 with the renewal of the earth.
Hmm.
You go from chaos into land showing up, and you get the
Hmm.
same story in the Egyptian account and accounts all over the world. So they're all talking about this renewal of the earth, and all of these gods are in place in polytheism at the renewal of the earth. And your perspective is going to be, is God doing this, or are the rebellious angels from our perspective, or the gods of polytheism doing this? And if it's the gods of polytheism, why do they have to renew the earth?
Hmm.
Well, and why does God have to renew the earth? Well, the answer to both is there was a war.
Hmm. Exactly. Complete destruction. Okay, so with these
Yeah.
powers, with these gods, demigods, these ancients, because we didn't get into the Titans, we haven't got. There's a lot. There's a lot. But when we see the powers of today, and we see who's really, I mean, these are powers that are behind the scenes, right? Um, who is
Yep.
really the
Invisible
Vatican?
ones. Yep.
Right. Like, what is really behind these, quote, governments? What is really behind, quote,
Yeah.
these large religions, the true power structure?
All of that power structure is controlled by the visible ones who are the descendants of the invisible ones. And so they take their genealogies, as I said, back to specific matriarchs and patriarchs, both angelic and um, Nephilim or Rephaim.
Hmm.
And they embed that in their coats of arms with their taciturn imagery. So if you
Hmm.
see like a serpent or a dragon or a lion, we already talked about what some of these angels look like, and they're going to embed those genealogies. And they created these standards for when the royals went into a different land, they would put it on a flag that the royale that was running that realm that they were going into would know exactly who they were. And they maintain those even to this day. And so they believe they are the elites, that they have earned, they've gained this through genealogies and being the noble ones. Aryans, as I say, these giants are Aryans. In Indo-Aryan, Indo-European, the word Aryan means the noble ones, the nobility. And that's what they call themselves. And they've populated the top two classes all throughout our history. So they controlled all of the religions.
Hmm.
They controlled all of the governments through the kings and the dynasties.
Hmm.
They controlled all of the education through the mystery schools sponsored by the mystery religion. And only the top two classes were educated. The lower two classes were not. They were to be a small entrepreneurial class like blacksmiths
Hmm.
or bakers or tailors, and then a slave or a sacrificial class at the bottom, or labor class. And they would also populate all of the oligarch class of the big business.
Mhm.
And we would see those big businesses coming down through history, controlled by the nobility. One of the biggest ones in North America at the beginning was the Hudson Bay Company,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
So yeah, so that was the structure. So even when Christianity starts up, and then it's going to sort of merge with Mithraism, in terms of much of the imagery, like they're used to the term father, black robes, December 25, birth date of Mithra. Um, I won't go through all of it, but there's a lot of things that Constantine is using to satisfy the empire and unite the empire, kind of what a uh, one of the kings did in Persia a few hundred years before that with Zoroastrianism, and he used that as the model to unite the empire. So when we look at Christianity, it's now becoming part of the power base within the Roman Empire. So now you're going to be able to put all of the educated nobility into the priesthood
Mhm.
and into the hierarchy of the Roman Church. I'm not saying all of the popes and all of them were completely non-Christian, but most of the royales were polytheistic, and so now they had control of the Christian church. Then you have Protestantism, then they get control of that as well, and it leads to not teaching about prehistory and prophecy, so that the Christians aren't prepared for what's coming.
Mhm.
So when we look at this, it's done through organizations as well. And, Vatican's an organization,
Mhm.
but there's secret societies who control organizations. So they have a hierarchy in the West that's they call the thelemic tree. And you have this tree trunk organization. If you try and do secret societies that control the world through pyramids, it's not big enough to accomplish. You get to the top and you haven't covered all of the organizations. So at the top of the thelemic tree is the 13 families,
Mhm.
and below that is the 30 council of 33 families. And then there's the committee of 300 families.
Mhm.
And then you have the Rosicrucians, and then you have the Illuminati, and then you
Mhm.
have Freemasonry at the first level. So Freemasonry is not Masonry. Masonry is of the Royals. Freemasonry is an organization that gets created after the fall of the Templars by the Sinclairs, who are Masons, are Royals. They actually take their bloodlines back
Ah.
to Rollo. Um, and so as we look at these trunk organizations, as I call them, you start to see that if you can imagine a cedar of Lebanon that the giants were described of in is Amos 2 as being as tall as the cedars of Lebanon at Mount Hermon, you have branches that come down like a cedar.
Mhm.
And so you have intersecting all around this tree different branches that go down in a hierarchy and branch out to multiple organizational structures that all come back to a central trunk organization. So, like the Illuminati, for example, they would have like the Skull and Bones as part of that.
Mhm.
Uh, Initiatory organization that's on campus that goes, right back to prehistory, like to the start of the secret societies through the mystery schools. I mean,
Mhm.
none of this is new. Um, and so you would have also, with the Illuminati, you might have Bohemian Grove as well.
Mhm.
That would pick most of the presidents in the United States, and different types of organizations that the Illuminati would be responsible, and they're higher, at least two degrees in the old system higher than third degree adept to be Illuminati and or oversee lodges.
Mhm.
And above that are the Rosicrucians, who are 50% pure blood at the top, with rising ones that come up that are lesser bloodlines from Freemasonry and Illuminati as they go up. So they might start at seven. I'm estimating here,
Mhm.
but the purebloods would be way higher because they're initiated from childhood, and they're adepts even before they're adult. And so it may go up as high as 33. Some people say more, but there are, but those are
Mhm.
reserved for the royales. And so, the Rosicrucians are responsible for um, all of the entertainment, the preservation of the history.
Mm.
Um,
Mhm.
and so, so when you have people like Walt Disney, he wasn't Freemason, he was Rosicrucian.
Mm. Mhm.
You know, Hollywood is basically information provided through Rosicrucians, and the famous actors are probably, picked and selected, providing they play ball.
Right.
Um, and so, and the Illuminati would also be, one of their agendas is to bring down Christianity. That's one of their goals, and to work on world government.
Mhm.
Um, the Committee of 300 would have like the Davos people intersecting into them. You
Mhm.
would have anything economic, so International Monetary Fund, World Bank, anything economic would go through the Committee of 300 as one of their major places, and money controls everything. You have to have that, and their money is off the books. You have no
Mhm.
idea how much money they have. It's unbelievable. They have places like Switzerland and other locations where that money is and wealth is stored, so we can't track it. And so you would have also like the Bilderbergers that would either intersect into the Committee of 300 or the Council of 33, and you have a senior and junior level to that. So you would have the royales. That's why you have the princes who are organizing the meeting, and then you have the new money coming in, like Bill Gates or the Clintons, and they go get their marching orders once a year. You would have
Mhm.
probably the Club of Rome, which has a senior or junior order that would probably be into. Some say the Committee of 300. Again, I think probably closer to the council of the the Council of the 33 families. The Jesuits is a little bit more interesting history because they have a start, a fall, and a restart. And it's the junior black nobility that sponsor them in the restart, but it's the senior black nobility beforehand. And the senior black nobility are like the Julia gens that goes back to the hundreds of families of senators that take their genealogies back to Romulus and Remus, the offspring of Ares or Mars in the Latin pantheon. And so depending on which one you want to have them answering into, they would go into because the junior
Mhm.
black nobility are the merchants that moved over from the Middle East, so like the Medicis, for example, and into Florence and Venice, and did most of the banking until uh, the Jesuits got control of the banking. And sorry, my dog's barking. And so. I would think, though, that they're probably because of the power and the control they have over the Vatican, I would put them into probably the Council of 33.
Mhm.
So imagine that branch organization. That's how they work. So, like the Illuminati that's focusing on world government, like, organizations like the CFR, Trilateral Organization, you know, heavily they're funded through graduates coming out of the Ivy League schools, like and through skull and bone operations into the CFR, then into the Trilateral and into other globalist communities. And there's other organizations like that in England and in Europe that do the same type of funding. They control it through the bloodlines and they control it through the money. And they've had these organizations that go right back to prehistory. Masonry takes their original startup back to Enoch, son of Cain, and through the
Oh.
mystery schools. That crosses the flood. And this is the knowledge that gets sent to Nimrod um, and the history. And Nimrod writes the first constitution for the Masons after the flood and becomes their first grand master.
So do these bloodlines, being of royal lineage, aka, these fallen ones, uh, gods and demigods, shining ones and parents, are they psychopathic? Whatever they are in their whatever they say fallen, what does that really mean? Um, are they psychopathic? Are they cut off from some divine connection? Because these are, I mean, the power structure is so dark and so rooted in ritual magic and ritual of every kind. Are these lineages, are they something other than royal? And
Yeah.
are there real royal lineages of a divine order? Or is it just these dark, psychopathic lineages?
Yeah, and we get accounts like in history, like before the flood, that the giants started off, as they say, as being dominated by their heavenly spirit, but the human side overtook it and made them evil, right?
Mm,
I don't know whether that's the case or not, but what I would say is that everybody has free choice and free will.
hmm
Now, it is much more difficult if you're in the families, whether pseudo blue blood in North America or the more pure bloods in Europe, to get out of those families. I mean, punishment by death uh, was not uncommon before. So it's difficult to leave. I'm going to do a show with Nathan Reynolds, who comes out of the Reynolds family.
Oh,
And
Nathan, yes.
yes, he had said my writings had gave him the courage to leave.
Oh,
So I'm gonna I'm gonna go and do a couple shows with him in the fall. So it's very difficult to get out. And he was shocked at some of the things and the information I put out and how accurate the information was. And he was surprised I was able to do it. And he thought, well, maybe now's the time because they want some of this stuff out there.
and he's a
So when
Nephilim
we look at,
bloodline.
yeah, they
Yeah.
believe they are.
hmm
And I get asked a lot, do you believe that they are? I said, it doesn't really matter.
hmm
They believe it. And
hmm
it's what they're doing with that belief system that we need to be focused on. So I think they have free choice. I think it's very difficult to make those choices. I think
hmm
you, right from childhood, are initiated, and it's very hard to look at things differently. They make it difficult for them to leave.
hmm
But it certainly is possible. We all have free choice. But I do think many of the leaders are like narcissistic,
hmm
and they seem to have a war gene.
hmm
That goes back to the warrior nature, and they've been creating and doing things through wars their whole history,
Yeah.
and that's likely to continue. So, um, what I do know is that there is a hierarchy within the bloodlines, and it
hmm
has to do with purity and nobleness. In other words, of other pure bloodlines being grafted in is where you're going to fit. So as you get to the top, you're going to have things like the uh, the Order of the Golden Fleece of the Bourbon family, who currently are connected to the Anjou, but the King of Spain, not Juan Carlos, that was his father, King Philippe, is the current King of Jerusalem that they believe they have the title for, that goes back to the Dubullion and the Templars and the first Anjous that were the kings of heaven in Jerusalem in the Middle Ages. And they believe they still have the rights to that. And the Golden Fleece is this knowledge, or the Golden Fleece is an allegory for the clothing that the gods or the giants would wear, or both, of this material that would help preserve their bodily physical nature, to preserve the physical aspect. And so you would also have another royal order up there of the Rollo bloodlines that goes back to Odin, through the Sinclairs, through the De
hmm
Bruces, through the De Geezers. And this is the Knights of the Seraphim Order. You couldn't get more obvious than that name that they chose
hmm
for that one. The Windsor Hanover bloodline would be the order that they use is the Order of the Garter, not the junior one, the senior order. So they have these Masonic Knight orders right at the top, and it's a tighter group as you go. So Queen Elizabeth, though, one presumes King Charles had a seat at the Bourbon Golden Fleece Order.
Ah.
So there's cooperation between some of these families and knight orders in alliances. And but there's also two rivals to the King of Jerusalem family of the Anjou. So the von Habsburgs used to have the King of Jerusalem title that they inherited through the descendants of the Payon, not the yeah, the Payon was Lorraine as well. Anjou of Lorraine and also de Bouillon of Lorraine,
Mhm.
when intermarriage went past that title on to the Habsburgs, and they maintained it right up until Juan Carlos. They still make a claim to be the true inheritors of the King of Jerusalem title and have their own Knight Order of the Golden Fleece. And then also the Anjou of the Italian nobility as well make a claim that's the name you would know as Savoy, but they're all Anjou.
Mm. So, but if you look at these royal lineages that we know of, these families, they're all intermarrying. So
Yeah.
who's really at the top in terms of like having the purest bloodline connected to those claims? If they're all intermarrying each other, like,
Yep. Well, and the Europeans were considered lower level to begin with. And but didn't accept the inferior position. So they created a diaspora of the Basques, for example, that they say they are the original bloodlines that started civilizations after the flood in their mythos. Homo Atlantis is the name that's I've heard that they like to have
well, I
their
was going to
genealogy,
ask
and
you about that.
their language is different than the Indo-Aryans. And so they claim a different descendancy after the flood. The Putyanin bloodline out of Kiev that had a junior offshoot of the Romanovs through intermarriage in the
Hmm.
1600s, they took them down because they had a superior bloodline and weren't cooperating.
Hmm.
The Western Europeans took down the Shah dynasty bloodline with the same virus of communism as they took down the Putyanin bloodline. They call it social masonry
Hmm.
that they developed and then launched that. And so that bloodline came down, but you now have a Xi from the Western bloodline of the Shah XIA dynasty on the throne. So they're pushing back. Putin believes he's a descendant of the Putyanin. Um,
Mm.
and he is pushing back on the Western Europeans as well. So how many real pure ones are out there?
Hmm.
It's, the rivalry has really helped to sort of to dilute that, but it's the Western Europeans that have been holding the power. And you could look at National Socialism as being launched to take down the Kaiser bloodline as well. Now, these bloodlines don't disappear, so they're still probably working in the back rooms.
And okay, in the Basque account, let's just go
Yeah.
to the Basques because I know for some strange reason they go out of their way to really omit information about the Basques and not, recognize anything.
Yep.
So
Yep.
are they Atlantean? Are they the ones that began, well,
Well, they
according to
say they are.
according to them, right?
Yep.
They began civilization.
Yep. Yep.
So in your research, what do you think? Who like did they? They seem to be extremely unique. They have like the
Mm.
O negative bloodline
Mhm.
blood type.
Yeah. Yeah. There's concentrations as high as 80% of
Hmm.
Rh negative blood and very heavily weighted to O negative.
Right.
So they're distinct from the other royales that we're aware of.
Hmm.
And if you subscribe to a story, then that because the Western Europeans kind of move out of the Middle East, those bloodlines kind of move over
Hmm.
um, as you follow their genealogy. So if you buy into the fact that some of the giants survived,
Hmm.
um, and that they helped seed civilization probably alongside some of the seven sages that show up after the flood as well, and that they came from this island continent.
Mm-hmm.
In many of those stories, there's a consistency there that suggests there might be some of that survival where they started it. And then the pedigree then is well, we are an older bloodline and more ancient, and you had more issues in terms of your in the second incursion with the fertility issue because giants before the flood didn't have a fertility issue, but after the
Oh.
flood they do. So there's a change between the Nephilim and the Rephaim.
Mm-hmm.
And the fertility issue manifests with the second incursion ones with the inability to produce enough females,
Oh,
which is why
interesting.
they value the matriarchal bloodline where the Rh negative blood and from the gene, from whichever gene, Julia gens, Creta gens, LB gens, all the different gens is passed on to, and how they start new dynasties with this pure blood matriarchal bloodline.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Starts to make some sense. And they have to dilute their bloodlines by starting to bringing in some humans, right? And that the
Yeah.
more pure ones would consider themselves superior to the Middle Eastern ones that come through. And that's how the Basques originally viewed themselves as more superior to the royals of Europe.
Mm-hmm. In your opinion, though, what are they?
I don't know. I think there's a strong possibility that there's something to that because the language is just completely different,
Mm-hmm.
and the genetics is different.
Mm-hmm.
So they are unique.
Mm-hmm. Right. So in the power structure that we see today with these lineages, these families, behind the scenes, can we say it all stems from, because let's go back to Mount Hebron and the 200 that fell, the fallen angels, the 200 of them. In one way or another, are we seeing the fruition of their agenda happening, or are we dealing with the 200 plus others?
Yeah, we don't know how many bloodlines were actually created
Hmm.
because there was initially 200, but we're
Yeah.
also told biblically that they did so again. We don't know what that means after the flood or many times before the flood or both.
Hmm.
And we don't know whether or not there is other ones that decided to do it later that, weren't even amongst the 200, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So we have no idea how many bloodlines there would be. And we don't know whether or
Hmm.
not the account that we have from the Enoch side is just a Middle Eastern version and other versions of the same type of thing on other mountains around the world were going on.
Hmm.
So we don't have all of that information. So what we do know is that there are surviving bloodlines. How many there are, I mean, I don't know.
Hmm.
The 13 families is only the Western bloodlines,
Yeah.
and there's bloodlines all around the world that, again, it's hard to verify the information that maybe three or four of the bloodlines of Europe are part of the larger 13.
Hmm.
And the bloodlines in North America, or I mean, Central America and South America weren't wiped out. The kings were killed initially by the Spanish and the Portuguese, but they were, by 1525, they had all received their royal status back and started to intermarry with a lot of European bloodlines. So, uh, there could be many of
Hmm.
those bloodlines still around as well that we might see pop up as we get closer to the end times. So
Hmm.
I have no idea how many legitimate bloodlines there are,
Hmm.
and there would have been ones that would have been intermarrying over time into higher bloodlines that may have been completely outside that claim a more royal pedigree than what they actually have. So it's really hard to answer those kind of questions.
Where would the Merovingian bloodline come into this all?
Well, they're the ones who are, the descendants of the Anjou
Hmm.
that made themselves the kings of Jerusalem. So de Bouillon was also a descendant of Dagobert, the last Merovingian, and also de Paon and the folk of Anjou as the main group. Um, and the Merovingians um, are a scioning. They were the most considered the most ennobled bloodline of that time. Now, we don't
Hmm.
know about China because we're dealing with sort of Western
Yeah.
history. So, and it wasn't just one pure bloodline, but they had probably several because it's ennobled. So
Hmm.
it's been ennobled with other pure bloodlines. And they also took their bloodlines also back to King David and to King Saul, which is where the Anjou get the rights to Jerusalem because Jerusalem in the Exodus was, or the conquest of the covenant land was awarded to the Benjamites. King Saul was a
Hmm.
Benjamite. So they have that grafted in according to their bloodlines. It's interesting that the allegorical description of the non-biblical bloodlines is not a minotaur, but a quinotaur,
Hmm.
and described with a bull's head. And Quinn is more associated like with maybe four. So like there could be four cherubim bloodlines or something that are intermixed with it, but it's an allegory that's used for their bloodline, ancient bloodlines that they didn't want to reveal that means something to them. But in this case, it has a bull's head. But again, we're talking about cherubim.
Hmm.
So, but they were classified and they were dark haired and black haired. So, and they had the ability to heal to a certain degree. So they have this connection back to giants that seemingly were in at least in the Syrian area or Mesopotamia. Um, in terms of taking those bloodlines back to, and they were priest kings, and those priest kings are more of Sumerian titles. So again, it seems to be more an amalgamation of some bloodlines, but very ennobled at that time.
Hmm. There's so many places to go with this all because, then you've got to ask the question also of the lost bloodlines. You got to ask the question about these fairy, who are all these in that we have in mythology,
Yeah,
right? Who and what
yeah,
are
like the
the
Tuatha De Danann
yeah,
or the
yeah,
fairy folk.
right.
Yeah,
And
Tuatha Danu or the Detanu, as we would understand that in the Ugaritic text, the tribes of the giants. These are the mostly red-haired and blonde-haired ones are the Tuatha De Danann.
hmm.
So I'm gonna, you probably want to edit this part out, but I'm gonna have to go
Oh, hang
pretty
on.
quick. I've got some.
Fascinating. Gary, this is absolutely amazing. We're going to continue this because there's just so much information. And we're going to do a part two, which is wonderful. So I just can't thank you enough, Gary. This is mind blowing. It's so deep.
It's been my pleasure. My pleasure.
And we'll see you soon. And yeah, in part two, everyone. So we'll thank you for being here.